Amman sits on 7 hills. The air in March is 14 degrees Celsius and completely dry. No moisture, no fog, no diffusion. Maximum resolution. Spring 1997. The man I had been watching for 9 years was sitting 12 feet away. His file was 47 words long. He had no idea I existed. And his 47 words were not enough. The Zarqa River runs east of the city, out of sight. You can look for it and not find it. It moves through its basin toward the Jordan without ever becoming the defining feature of the city it flows beneath. Amman does not face its water. Amman faces its hills, the 7 historical hills that give the city its topography, its sightlines, its specific quality of a place where elevation matters more than flow. I registered this at 0740 hours on the first morning of the Amman posting, standing at the operational accommodation window and looking west across the hillside geography. The temperature was 14 degrees. The light at that hour was already higher than the equivalent light in any European posting at any equivalent hour. This latitude, in March, puts the sun at an angle that the northern postings cannot produce until well into their mornings. Everything came in sharp. The limestone of the buildings across the valley, the radio antenna on the hill to the northwest, the color of the sky, which was a specific blue that the European moisture did not allow, because the European moisture diffused the blue into the gray that I had learned to calibrate against fluorescent at 4,100 Kelvin. Amman's light did not require that calibration. Amman's light was its own reference. I walked to the window, noted the Zarqa's absence as presence. The water was there. To the east, moving through its basin. I simply could not see it, and filed the first registration of the Amman posting. The formation's first requirement in any new environment: map the water. Here, the water was a direction rather than a view. East, flowing, unseen. I made coffee. The operational accommodation provided a machine with adequate temperature control 90 degrees Celsius, without grind adjustment, correct extraction from the first morning. I noted this. The Bonn machine had required grind adjustment. The Brussels machine had required grind adjustment. The Amman machine did not. Small data point. Filed. The accommodation was 39 square meters. 3rd floor. The window faced west. The operational day began at 0830. The man whose file I had been carrying since 1988 was in this city, 50 years old. Still running the same cultural liaison work he had been running when the file was opened 9 years earlier. Still reading the world before the world knew it was changing. 47 words. That morning. Standing at the window with the coffee at 90 degrees, and the Amman light doing what Amman light does at 740 inches, March, I registered the specific weight of 9 years of patience, not satisfaction. Not anticipation. Weight. The specific load that a thin file carries across the years it has been waiting to grow. The bank had been holding this particular piece of the river since Bonn. The water had been moving. The moment had not yet arrived. It arrived 6 hours later. The Regional, Cultural, and Economic Dialogue Conference was held at a hotel in central Amman, west side, 3rd floor. The conference room had west-facing windows. At 1,420 hours in March, the light through those windows had the specific quality that Amman afternoon light has, lower than midday, warmer. The limestone of the buildings on the opposite hillside beginning to do what Amman limestone does with low-angle light. The color temperature was dropping from the midday 6,000 Kelvin towards something closer to 4,000. The room was warm with it. The dry air held the warmth without dissipating it. Yusuf al-Rashid sat 14 feet away. The specific distance was registered automatically. The formation does not require deliberate effort to register physical distances in operational environments. 14 feet. The room was arranged for 40 people. 37 were present. He was in the third row from the front on the left side. I was in the fourth row on the right. He was listening to a presentation about regional investment frameworks. He was also doing something that the 47 words had documented the outputs of, but had never been able to document the process of. He was reading the gap, not the presentation. The gap between the presentation and what the presentation was not saying. The distance between the position being expressed at the front of the room and the interest behind the position. The information that the presenter had chosen to include and the information the presenter had chosen to manage. I registered a recalibration requirement at 1,420 hours. Filed it. The assessment machinery noted the file had documented this capacity accurately. The file had not documented the mechanism. The mechanism, in the unmediated register of actual presence rather than behavioral documentation, was visible for the first time. The file was 47 words. The person was not 47 words. The person was the mechanism the 47 words had described the outputs of without being able to describe the process. Received. The recalibration was beginning. Let me tell you what the mechanism was, because this is what the episode is about and what the 9 years of the thin file could not transmit. Most people in a professional meeting attend to what is being said. The words, the stated positions, the explicit information. This is not a failure of attention. It is the appropriate application of attention to the standard professional context, where the stated content is the primary relevant content. Al-Rashid attended to the stated content and simultaneously to the relationship between the stated content and the unstated content, the gap. The distance between what a person says and what a person is managing, the asymmetry between the information volunteered and the information withheld. The angle of the interest behind the position. This is what the formation builds. This is what the Thursday sessions at West Point described in the vocabulary of pattern recognition. This is what the operational career across Vienna and Bonn and London and Budapest and Brussels had been applying in every professional environment, every meeting, every contact interaction across 16 years of work. Al-Rashid had built the same capacity without any of that. 50 years of operating at the intersection of cultural, political, and economic networks in a region where the gap between what is said and what is meant is structurally larger than it is in any Western professional context. He had built it through pressure and time. The environment had required it. The requirement had produced the capacity. I drank the coffee 90 degrees. The Amman afternoon light held the conference room in its specific 4,000 Kelvin warmth. The presentation continued. Al-Rashid listened to it. I registered that he was listening to it and to everything it was not saying simultaneously. The 47 words were now insufficient. A new category was required. The Amman posting had been structured around a specific operational question. The question was whether Al-Rashid's unusual reading capacity was a personal attribute, something that belonged to the person, or a positional attribute, something that belonged to his specific location at the intersection of the regional networks that his work had placed him at. The distinction is operationally significant. A personal attribute travels with the person. Remove him from his current position, and the capacity moves with him. A positional attribute is tied to the position. Remove him from the position, and the capacity disappears, because the position was generating it, not the person. 9 years of the 47-word file had not been able to determine which category applied. The file was a reduction of observed outputs. The observed outputs were consistent regardless of which explanation was correct. A personal attribute explanation and a positional attribute explanation would both produce the same observable behavioral signatures. The file could not distinguish between them. Only proximity could. And proximity was what the Amman posting provided. I attended 6 professional meetings with Yusuf al-Rashid across 14 months. The conference in March 1997 was the first. The others followed at intervals produced by the professional overlap between my operational cover and al-Rashid's network, the specific adjacency that the posting's operational logic had been structured to create. Each meeting contributed data to the assessment. Each meeting updated the probability calculation. By the third meeting, in June of 1997, the assessment was pointing in one direction. By the sixth meeting, in February of 1998, the direction was confirmed with a probability weight sufficient for the operational conclusion. The capacity was personal, not positional. The regional networks had provided the environment in which the capacity had been built, but the capacity lived in the person, not the position. Move him to a different intersection with different networks, a different region, a different set of institutional adjacencies, and the outputs would be the same. The mechanism was portable because the mechanism was in the person, not in the position. The file updated. 47 words became 61 in Bonn. 61 became 112 after the first Amman meeting. 112 became 189 by the close of the posting in May of 1998. Still thin by operational standards, but the shape had changed. From a record of outputs to a partial map of the mechanism that produced the outputs. The map was partial because the mechanism was only partially visible, even in the unmediated register of actual presence. What became visible was the capacity itself and its specific quality, the gap reading, the asymmetry detection, the preformal pattern recognition. What did not become fully visible was the specific way the mechanism processed the information it was attending to. The process remained partly opaque. Partially legible was better than entirely opaque, which is what the file had given me across 9 years, 189 words. Growing, quote, quote. Patient. The question that belongs in the middle of this account, placed here, because this is where the structure puts the weight that the account is building toward, is this. A man with no institutional training, no formation, no Thursday sessions, no Fort Huachuca desert calibration, no professional vocabulary for what he was doing built. Through 40 years of pressure and environment, the same capacity that years of deliberate institutional formation built in me, the outputs are identical. The mechanism is different in its origin, but arrives at the same place. What does that mean? I have been sitting with this question since 20 hours in a conference room in Amman in March of 1997. 27 years of subsequent experience have run the assessment. The finding is this: not a conclusion, a current state of assessment. The capacity does not belong to the institution that built it. The institution did not invent the capacity. The institution systematized it, made it reproducible, made it teachable, made it available to people who would not have developed it through environment alone in the operational time frame the institution required, but the institution did not create it. The capacity existed before the formation. It exists outside the formation. Al-Rashid built it through a path that the formation would not recognize as the correct path, and he arrived at the same destination. This changes the assessment of the 47 words. The 47 words had been written with the implicit assumption that what Al-Rashid was doing was anomalous, an outsider demonstrating something that was supposed to belong to insiders. This framing was wrong. The capacity is not anomalous. The path was different. The destination was the same. The file had been treating a naturally occurring capacity as a deviation from an institutional norm that does not, in fact, define the capacity's boundaries. The probability assessment updated. The third file, updated, 112 words, became 189. The shape of what the file was describing changed from an anomaly to a natural occurrence, rare but not anomalous. The distinction between those two categories is significant in the assessment vocabulary. Anomalies require institutional responses. Natural occurrences require institutional understanding. The Amman posting had changed what the file was measuring. That was its operational contribution. The Easter egg from Brussels is present in Amman, though it took time to register it. Brussels had given me the Seine, the buried river, present but not visible. Its current estimated from surface effects rather than direct observation. The formation's capacity for registering what is present but not visible. The water that is there even when you cannot see it move. Amman had the Zarqa. Also east of the city, also not visible from the operational geography, also flowing through its basin without being the city's dominant feature. But the Zarqa was not buried by 19th century urban renovation. The Zarqa was simply further away than the operational geography reached. The absence was geographical rather than institutional. The difference was significant. Brussels's Seine was hidden deliberately for reasons of institutional management, the cholera, the renovation, the decision to make the flow invisible. Amman's Zarqa was simply distant. No decision had been made to hide it. It was present and flowing and not directly visible because the geography of the city had developed on its hills rather than on its banks. Al-Rashid's capacity had the Zarqa quality, not the Seine quality. Not hidden by institutional management, simply operating at a distance from the vocabulary that would describe it. Present, flowing, love. And unseen not because it had been buried, but because the geography of the professional networks that surrounded him had not produced the language to name what he was doing. He was doing it anyway. The language, or its absence, did not affect the doing. The formation had the Seine quality. Its capacity was buried in vocabulary and procedure and institutional structure. Not hidden in the pejorative sense, buried in the sense of being enclosed, channeled, made to flow through specific conduits. The Seine was still water. The formation's capacity was still a capacity. The enclosure did not eliminate the function. It organized it. Al-Rashid's capacity and the formation's capacity were the same water taking different courses through the same territory. I registered this at 1,845 hours on a March evening in Amman, standing at the accommodation window, watching the limestone on the hillside hold the last of the afternoon light at 4,000 Kelvin. The temperature was 17 degrees. The dry air was absorbing the warmth quickly. The Zarqa was to the east, moving through its basin. The accommodation was 39 square meters. The desk lamp was 4,100 Kelvin. The coffee had been correctly extracted at 90 degrees since the first morning without adjustment. Received, registered, filed. 6 meetings, 14 months. 189 words. The sixth and final meeting with Yusuf al-Rashid during the Amman posting occurred in February of 1998 at a smaller professional function in the western part of the city. The occasion was a closing dinner for a regional policy dialogue that had run across the preceding 18 months. Al-Rashid had been a regular presence at the dialogue. My operational cover had been a regular presence. The sixth meeting was the natural conclusion of a professional adjacency that had produced 6 data points across 14 months. The dinner was in a room on the second floor of a building whose stone construction was the specific Amman limestone that the city's older buildings are made of. The color at 2,000 hours was the interior artificial light, warmer than 4,100 Kelvin, more amber, the specific quality of private function room lighting rather than government facility fluorescent. The temperature outside was 9 degrees Celsius. Inside the function room, the warmth of 26 people and the artificial lighting held the space at approximately 21 degrees. Al-Rashid sat 3 places away, not directly across, diagonal. The positioning allowed for conversational inclusion without direct interaction, the kind of seating that professional social events produce when the organizers know who has professional adjacency with whom and arrange the tables to reflect it without making the reflection obvious. The assessment was complete by this point. The personal versus positional question had been answered 3 meetings earlier. The mechanism had been mapped partially, sufficiently. The file was 167 words by the beginning of the 6th meeting. The 6th meeting would add 22 words, 189 at the close. What the 6th meeting produced that the 5 before it had not produced was a specific exchange that belonged in the file, not as evidence for the assessment that had already been completed, but as a registration of what the completed assessment had cost. The exchange was brief. Al-Rashid spoke to me directly, for the first time in the 6 meetings, not in the conference context, not in the professional function context, but in the margin of the evening's social conversation. The specific register that exists at the edge of professional events, where the professional vocabulary relaxes slightly and something else occasionally appears. He said something. I am not reproducing it directly because the formations method of recording exchanges does not reproduce them with fictional precision. I am describing what was communicated. What was communicated was this. He had noticed the quality of attention I brought to professional conversations. He had registered it as unusual. He had registered it as recognizable. He had not named what it was recognizable as. He had simply noted it in the specific register of 2 people who share a capacity and recognize it in each other across a professional context without the recognition being stated. I registered this at 2,047 hours. The function room was at 21 degrees. The lighting was amber and warm. The Zarqa was east of the city, flowing. The file was 167 words on the way to 189. Received, registered, quote. The filing of this specific data point would require the register below the professional vocabulary, which is where it went. The cost of 9 years of proximity assessment is that by the end of those 9 years, the subject has also registered you. The assessment is never entirely one-directional. The observer is always also being observed. The bank holds its position, but the water reads the bank's position as it passes. He had read me. I had read him. Neither of us acknowledged it. Filed. The Amman posting concluded in May of 1998. The operational file had been updated. The assessment question had been answered. The 3rd file had grown to 189 words. The probability assessments attached to each element of the mechanism map were current. The carrying structure left Amman with something it had not arrived with. Not a new category of weight in the same sense that Vienna had added the Victor Hale weight, or London had added the contact trust cost weight, or Budapest had added the calibration arrow, or Brussels had added the Sension. Compliance loyalty gap. Those weights had been specific and heavy from the moment they were placed on the structure. What Amman placed on the structure was lighter in mass and heavier in implication. A question mark located at a specific address in the architecture, not adding mass to the load, adding a marked location where future mass would arrive. The question mark had been present since Bonn in 1988. The 47 words had been a question mark from the moment they were filed, a thin file marking a location for a significance that had not yet arrived. Amman had made the question mark more specific. The location was the same. The shape of the question was clearer. The significance was still approaching. 2003 was 5 years away. The Zarqa moved east through its basin, out of sight. The water was there. The city faced its hills. The light in Amman in May is vertical again, the morning clarity of maximum resolution restored. The low-angle amber of the March and April evenings given way to the direct overhead light of late spring. 14 degrees had become 28. The dry air produced steam dispersal under 1 second at 90 degrees faster than any previous posting. The moisture absorbed immediately. I stood at the accommodation window at 0740 on the last morning of the posting. The Zarqa to the east, the hills to the west, the limestone in the direct morning light, gray-white rather than amber, maximum resolution rather than low-angle warmth. The accommodation was 39 square meters. The machine had extracted at 90 degrees without adjustment across 14 months. I had not needed to change the grind once. Small data point. Filed. The last filing of the Amman posting. Received, registered, filed. The formation runs continuously. In 14 months of Amman mornings, the specific clarity of the dry air had become the calibration reference. The Rhine and the Thames and the Danube had been in the European postings. Not water, light. The same formation, a different instrument. One more thing, and then the account moves forward. In the spring of 1997, sitting in a conference room in Amman at 1420 hours, with the afternoon light at 4000 Kelvin, and Yusuf al-Rashid 14 feet away, demonstrating a capacity that 9 years of file had documented without explaining, I registered a deviation in the expected output of the assessment machinery. The deviation was this. The assessment machinery had been calibrated for the file. The file was a reduction. The person exceeded the reduction. The calibration was therefore insufficient for the actual assessment target. This is not the first time in this account that the assessment machinery's calibration has proved insufficient for its actual target. Victor Hale in West Berlin had produced 12 threshold assessments that were each individually correct and whose aggregate had been insufficient. The Contact in London had produced an assessment of motivational structure and access quality that was operationally accurate and personally costly. Budapest had produced the recognition that the calibration arrow could point in the wrong direction. Brussels had produced the finding that the mandate's premise was wrong. Amman produced the recognition that the file is always a reduction. The person always exceeds the reduction. The gap between the file and the person is the space where the actual assessment lives. 9 years of file had given me the outline. 14 months of proximity had given me something closer to the interior. The interior was not fully visible. It never is. The assessment continues. The formation builds you for this. The formation builds the specific capacity for sustained observation and pattern recognition and probability assessment that the gap reading requires. The formation does not tell you that the gap between the file and the person is permanent, that no amount of proximity will fully close it, that the file is always insufficient, that the person always exceeds the words used to contain them. The formation does not tell you this, because the formation is not designed for the register where this knowledge lives. The formation builds the tools. What you do with the tools and the register below the vocabulary, how you carry the knowledge of their insufficiency alongside the continued application of their method. This is the architecture that the operational career builds in the space the formation leaves open. 189 words. Still a reduction. Still an insufficient container for the person they describe. Still growing. Still patient. The gray operative. Every week, without exception. Start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was. And if this episode has pressed into you the specific recognition that every file you carry about another person, every category you have placed them in, every behavioral pattern you have attributed to them, every probability assessment you have attached to your understanding of who they are, is a reduction of the actual person who exceeds your file in ways you cannot see without proximity, and sometimes not even then. Then the episode has done what these accounts intend, not to answer the question. To press the weight of it into the structure you are building by listening in sequence. The order is the architecture. The architecture is the account. The carrying continues. The gray operative, every week, without exception. There is a specific aspect of the Amman posting that I have not yet described, and it belongs here because it belongs to the triad rule, and because the triad rule requires that every section carry its weight, its action, and its technical registration. The aspect is the specific operational texture of 14 months in a city whose calibration reference was light rather than water. Every previous posting had organized the daily rhythm around the river. In Vienna, the Danube Walk. In Bonn, the Rhine Bank at 0800. In London, the Thames Embankment at whatever hour the operational morning began. In Budapest, the Chain Bridge crossing at 0830 hours, 47 times registered. In Brussels, the Grand Place at 1215 hours for the midday light, because Brussels in December has only 8 hours of useful daylight, and the midday hour was the posting's only natural light. In Amman, there was no river walk. There was a hill. The hill was the third of the 7 hills that the city's historical center occupied. The Jabal al-Qala, the Citadel Hill, where the Roman temple ruins and the Umayyad palace ruins and the Byzantine church ruins exist in their specific, layered archaeological relationship, 3 civilizations occupying the same elevated ground across 2,000 years of the city's continuous habitation. I walked to the Citadel at 0800 hours on 31 mornings during the Amman posting. Not operationally required. The formation had produced the habit of marking the environment at the same hour each morning, and the Citadel at 0800 was the Amman equivalent of the Rhine Bank and the Thames Embankment and the Chain Bridge. The view from the Citadel at 800 inches March looks east across the city's hill and valley. Topography toward the horizon where the Zarqa Basin runs. You cannot see the Zarqa from the Citadel. The river is too far and the valley too wide. But from the Citadel, at that height, approximately 850 meters above sea level, approximately 100 meters above the city center, below the direction of the Zarqa Basin, is legible in the topography. The land tilts east toward it. The hills descend in that direction. The valley opens. You can register the direction of the flow without seeing the flow. This is what the formation does. With information it cannot directly observe. Register the direction from the topography. Note which way the land tilts. Estimate the flow from the shape of the valley rather than the observation of the water. I registered this at 0800 hours on the first Citadel morning in March of 1997. The temperature was 12 degrees colder than the accommodation, the elevation adding its specific degree drop to the March morning air. The light at 0800 from the Citadel height was already fully operational, not the angled low sun of the European mornings, but the direct Levantine morning light that this latitude and this elevation produced in combination. The Roman temple columns to the north caught the light at their specific angle. The Umayyad palace ruins to the south were in shade until 0830. When the sun cleared the hill behind them, I stood at the Citadel at 0800 on 31 mornings and looked east toward the invisible Zarqa and registered the tilting of the land and filed it. The formation running continuously, the water was there. The topography told me its direction, received, registered, filed. Al-Rashid did the same thing with information. He could not see the underlying interest behind a stated position directly. No one can. Not even the formation's most precise instruments. But he read the topography of the statement, the way the argument tilted, the direction toward which the evidence pointed, even when the evidence was managed to point away. He registered the tilt and inferred the direction of the flow. The formation does this through deliberate training across years of calibration. Al-Rashid did it through the accumulated pressure of 50 years of operating in environments where the tilting was always present and always consequential. The tool was the same. The path to the tool was different. The Citadel view was the same view. The legs that carried you to it had taken different routes. The third file reached 189 words in May of 1998, but the number that mattered was not the total word count. The number that mattered was the change in the file's relationship to what it was describing. At 47 words, Bonn, 1988. The file was a behavioral observation with a probability weight attached. Someone outside the formation was demonstrating a formation-adjacent capacity. The probability weight assigned to the observation, worth monitoring. The assessment category, unusual environmental reading capacity. The operational implication, potential value, nature undetermined. At 61 words, the gradual additions across 1989 to 1996. The file was the same observation, with additional behavioral data points, confirming the initial assessment. No new category. Same weight, same implication. At 112 words, Amman, March 1997. After the first meeting, the file was something different. Not a behavioral observation, a mechanism observation. The gap reading capacity had become partially visible. The file now contained not just what the person did, but a preliminary map of how he did it. The probability weight attached to the mechanism observation significant. The assessment category, pre-formal pattern recognition. Mechanism partially mapped. 2. The operational implication. The significance is approaching, but not yet arrived. At 189 words, Amman, May 1998. The posting's close. The file contained the personal versus positional conclusion, the mechanism, partial map, and the February exchange registration. The February exchange was the data point that changed the file's character most fundamentally, because it was the first data point in 10 years that was not observation of the subject. It was observation of the relationship between the subject and the observer. Al-Rashid had registered the observer. The file had to contain that registration. The file had to acknowledge that the assessment was no longer entirely one-directional. A file that contains the subject's registration of the observer is a different kind of file from a file that contains only the observer's registration of the subject. It is a file in which the asymmetry has partially collapsed. Not completely the file itself, its existence, its specific content, its operational purpose, remained asymmetric. Al-Rashid did not have a file on me. He had a registration of a specific quality of attention in a professional context. I had a file on him. The asymmetry was maintained. But the file now contained evidence that the subject had registered the observer, which meant the file had to register the observer's registration by the subject, which meant the file was now partially a record of both directions of a relationship that had been structured to run in only one direction. This is the specific cost of proximity assessment across extended time. The assessment is never entirely one-directional. The observer is always also being observed. The bank holds its position. The water reads the bank as it passes. After 10 years and 6 meetings, Yusuf al-Rashid had read the bank. The bank had registered the reading. The file contained both. 189 words. The file was now a different kind of reduction than the 47 words had been. Not a smaller reduction, the person still exceeded the file by dimensions that no file could contain, but a reduction that acknowledged what it could not contain rather than simply being insufficient without acknowledging the insufficiency. That acknowledgement was itself a kind of progress. The formation had built the capacity to detect the gap between the file and the person. 10 years of the Al-Rashid file had built the capacity to acknowledge the gap in the file itself. The file that knows it is insufficient is closer to the truth than the file that does not know it. 189 words, 2003, was 5 years away. The file was patient. The significance was approaching. The architecture held what had been placed on it and waited for what was coming. The bank holds. The water moves. The Zarqa runs east, out of sight, through its basin toward the Jordan. The city faces its hills. The light in Amman is the calibration reference when the water is too far to see. The gray operative. every week, without exception. Start from episode 1. The order is not a suggestion. It never was. And if you have been here, since Pittsburgh, since the first episode, since the quality of attention that the formation would later name and that existed before the naming, then you understand that the account is not moving toward a resolution. It is moving toward a weight. The specific weight that arrives when everything that has been building toward it finally arrives at the location that has been marked since a thin file opened in Bonn in 1988 with 47 words and a question mark, and the patience of something that knows it is waiting for something that is still coming. The order is the architecture. The architecture holds the question mark. The question mark holds its location. At 2003 is 5 years away. The gray operative, every week, without exception.